気がついた。あなたは自分の名前は言える？
My favorite movie of all time, Perfect Blue by Satoshi Kon, is a masterpiece in psychological horror. And Oymisville, a rather obscure post-apocalyptic novel, happens to be my favorite book of all time. Now, this second fact shouldn't really be a surprise if you take a look at my channel. What might be a surprise, however, for those familiar with the movie and the book, is that I am going to prove how the plotline of Perfect Blue's Mima Kirigoe is actually parallel to Oymisville's author, Ernst Jünger. But that's assuming you are in fact familiar with both of these amazing stories. See, I'm going to go ahead and make a hot take and assume that those who watch anime probably aren't familiar with Jünger, and at the same time, those who read Jünger probably aren't too familiar with anime either. And that's perfectly okay because, well, the fact that you decided to watch this video means that you are in all likelihood familiar with one of them. So, by comparing the two and showing how they mirror each other ultimately becomes an opportunity to introduce you to the other. Unfortunately and understandably, I can only do this by adding in major spoilers for the anime, but thankfully not so much for the novel or Ernst Jünger's life, because, well, I guess one can argue that, in a way, like the mystical figures that he always talked about, can't be spoiled. But with that being said, for the Jünger fans, I want you to meet Perfect Blue, a horror film set in 90s Japan where the protagonist named Mima Kirigoe decides to take a career in acting only to be forced to endure an arduous psychological journey of self-disassociation as she goes insane from having to contend with the ghost of her past as a pop idol. And for the Perfect Blue fans, I want you to meet Oymisville, a post-apocalyptic novel set in the northern regions of Africa where the protagonist lives a life under the watchful eyes of the authoritarian government that he works for. While we are at it, I want to also introduce you to the book's author, Ernst Jünger, my favorite historical figure of all time. See, Ernst Jünger was a quintessential 20th century man. Living for over 100 years, he was there to witness all that the century had to offer. Standing on the front lines of the Great War to becoming immersed in psychedelic drug experiments, Jünger was there to document, to comprehend, but most importantly foresee the zeitgeist unfold around him. And Jünger is a must-read for anyone on a path to a practical meta-understanding of the history of today. Welcome to the Existentias Non Grata, and today I am going to embark in a two-part series where I talk about how Jünger's life is mirrored by the world of anime. Protagonist begins in the story by having their sense of self destroyed by forces beyond them, be it that of people in positions of power or something more omnipresent as, for example, the ways in which technology changes their social lives. These forces ultimately try to define and box the protagonist into an oversimplistic form of living, diminishing the act of being into one-dimensional character of a free human being. Unable to withstand these powers that be, protagonist decides to instead commit to a total subordination to the system in power so as to quell the conflict within the social order. However, this ultimately backfires, and they only regret this when the consequences manifest itself. Upon reflection of the aftermath, a process of soul-searching is then taken up in order to help themselves out of the form of living that they have been restricted to all along. Now, hopefully you are smart enough to infer from the images that just corresponded with what I just said to realize that this is a description for both Ernst Jünger and Mima Kirigoe. And see, this is the first of many ways in which their lives run parallel with each other. Kirigoe had her sense of self restricted to a pop idol, and Jünger, on the other hand, well, he was restricted to many things at many times of his life, but That's only because his life was about 5 times longer than that of Mima that manifested in the movie. Indeed, when the circumstances of the day try to define them into characters of being, the two of them initially try to become it to its fullest extent, only to realize that one must transcend beyond these forms. This realization came after being confronted by the consequences of being fixed to a specific caricature. For Mima, her identity as a pop idol came into strong conflict with her new identity of an actress. As a consequence, this schism within the self was the cause of the descent into her madness and insanity. This was further heightened by her submission to the whims of people in power. But this was nothing compared to what Junger had to endure. His role as a soldier, which was put under immense pressure for reasons I explained in this video, was then thrusted onto the role of what he called the worker. However, once he saw how fixations on forms, especially that of political forms, led to not only disaster but more importantly failure, he decided to mature beyond forms altogether. Both Junger's and Kiriko's maturity came after the realization that benefiting the powers that be in totality does not necessarily leave oneself free from the consequences. In other words, even a total submission to a domineering entity won't save oneself from suffering. For Junger and Kiriko, they realized total submission and negating themselves in the process was not the option. So they had to tap into something within, something that Junger called the Anarch. See, this is where the book Oimizou comes into play, because the post-apocalyptic novel went into that concept called the Anarch. And I went over it in this video here, and the Anarch is hard to define precisely because it is a label given to that which is formless. However, to explain it in more clear terms, or as Junger would say, to make the vague more precise, the Anarch can be said to manifest as a sovereign individual, free of all attachments to governments and the systems that seek to protect and destroy them. Now, in this video, one commenter asked if this so-called Anarch was a state of mind. The answer is yes, but it is also a state of being. As I said, it is a being that precedes a fixed form, be it the fixed form of an ideology, an occupation, or a contract like marriage. To give an example, fighting is anarchic, but boxing is not, because boxing is preceded by the form of fighting. This was how Junger found his freedom. All his life, he was determined to find a freedom in a specific fixed form, be it in the form of a soldier, worker, revolutionary conservative partisan, or a rebel. However, it was by becoming one with that which preceded all of the above where he found freedom. This was because by transcending forms, he was able to live in a more unrestricted manner, and more importantly, reject the categorical restrictions placed upon him by society. And believe it or not, this was exactly how Mima found her freedom. By getting into touch with that which was behind the profession, in this case being a pop idol or acting, she was able to transcend these restrictive forms. Initially, a total submission to these forms have led to the negation of the anarchic entity behind the acting. It led to the negation behind the anarchic entity behind the pop idol. This anarchic entity was affirmed when Kiriko was able to assert it even in the face of a predetermined formula that she had originally, like many others, prescribed to because it offered a safe and predictable mode of being, a formula written by others to follow. This plotline of having a sense of self destroyed only to suffer it more through total submission before finally become free by tapping into the Anarch is how Mima and Junger mirror each other.
さあ終わりにしよう。ミマは2人もいらないんだもん。私が見るわよ。冗談。ミマはアイドルなんだよ。あなたは汚い見せ物よ。そんな
yes, you're right, the life of a veteran of both world wars may not seem familiar with a pop idol who became an actor, but forget the forms. I am talking about the thematic similarities behind the events. No matter who one is, no matter what one had to go through, anyone can become swept up by the world around them and struggle to assert who they are in a society that ultimately tries to define them and put them in categories.
じゃ、もう一度頭からいくよ。はい、テイク2!
In 1927, in a Germany that had been turned upside down by the Treaty of Versailles, and where the Kaiser was dethroned, Junger was busy trying to comprehend the new world order that he found himself in. In his essay Progress, Freedom, and Necessity, Junger writes, "In our technical era, the individual appears to be ever more dependent, unfree, and endangered, but the nature of these bonds are less visible than those of the feudal era. Hence, they are even more absolute than the absolutist of monarchies." Essentially, from his experiences in the Great War, he realized that there was now an unprecedented relationship between technology and total mobilization. And with the advent of technology and capitalism, not only did it deconstruct the individual constituents of society, it has ultimately rendered them completely powerless and dependent on the technological social order.
Seldom do individual soldiers fight against each other. This is a war against overwhelming machines that make the individual soldier appear smaller and smaller until he disappears.
And this is where the parallels to Perfect Blue shows itself yet again. See, the individual was deconstructed to a mere form that suited the social order. In Junger's case, it was, as I mentioned above, the technological order. But like I said, the thematic similarities behind the events is what's important, because in both cases, they saw themselves deconstructed and subordinated to the system that dominated the day. In a much more famous but still rather obscure book, the Essay on Pain essentially tried to ground human meaning through pain after realizing that technology has stripped man of its individuality. And this was how Junger submitted to the social order. It was servitude to the titanic order that he was enslaved to. Therefore, On Pain was also will to submission to the powers that be. This is exactly what Mima engaged in. A submission to the music industry, a submission to the system, and a submission to the realities prescribed onto her. Junger surrendered to the technological forces. It was a will to a loss of reason and feeling. Therefore, Junger declared a will to a loss of self, without having ever established it in the first place. This anonymous enslavement ended with the anarchic emancipation. Junger's 100-year life was essentially a story about a man trying to find himself in the midst of the chaotic times. Junger was ultimately trying to find himself in the various forms that manifested in his life, only to realize that the self was behind the forms all along. It was the essence that preceded the forms. Junger's original nihilistic submission to technology was followed by an enlightening epiphany of the anarch. Like Junger, Mima too was an observer of changing times that changed so fast that she was never able to figure out who she really was in the first place. Therefore, what she observed existed before who did the observing was realized. In Oymisville, the main character's behavior and even their names is subjected to the will of the tyrant, who in no way shapes the reality that they are situated in. But Manuel, the protagonist, being the anarch, is able to wear it like a shell, to blend in and be protected, but he remains the same underneath and can easily take it off to adjust. And until Mima too developed the shell, there were powers that be that tried to force her to return to the form of a teen idol. It's an interesting question of what happens when your role in society is heavily based on how others like you, because in the end, for Mima, it led to an obsessive behavior from the part of her fans. And more importantly, it is also a question of building a self in all this struggle, but that's another topic, one that will be expanded upon in another video coming soon. In any case, Mima was being forced to accept multiple realities at the same time, which caused her to descend into insanity. For Mima, she could not stand on her own yet. She wasn't a person yet. So, when the form of the idol seemed to flee, she had to chase it because she has yet to affirm the being behind the form, which is to say, the person behind the idol, the person behind the actor. For those yet to find themselves, life will always be a tragedy in the dramatic sense, as it was a tragedy for Rumi, who was unable to move beyond the confines of her idol identity, and as it would have been for Junger had he been unable to move beyond the confines of the archetypes that he was so fixated on. Fans of the movie will point out that it was a voice actor for the manager who said that she was real. This has sparked fear in the hearts of the audience, lest it imply that Rumi had taken over Mima. But I prefer to interpret that as it was actually Mima and Rumi integrated, and the entire movie was actually a metaphor for Mima's struggle to understand if she's her idol self or her actor self. But she realizes that these are merely forms constructed to fit a given social order. Mima represents those who tap into their anarchic potential. Rumi, on the other hand, represents the partisans mentioned in the book Oymasville who are prevented from maturing precisely because they are stuck within the confines of a fixed form of being, be it the form of an ideology or the form of an identity. But for them, they are often one and the same. Rumi was stuck in the identity of being an idol, and the traumatic experiences that Mima had to go through ultimately triggered that past in Rumi. You see, Rumi too remembers in her life when she was forced to move beyond being a pop idol. But because she couldn't, she therefore tried to kill anyone that tried to get Mima out of her idol stage, if only to preserve that archetype. And if you look at the partisans of today and history, that is precisely what they do. They engage in the destruction of the world if only to distract themselves from the fact that it is really their own identity that is sinking.
"私は本物だよ。